On a humid August morning in 1995, in a town so small that everyone knew everyone else's business, a young woman named Rebecca Marshall vanished from her modest home on Elm Street in Greencastle, Indiana. She was 28 years old, a devoted mother to two small children, and by all accounts, she had been planning a normal Thursday. Her coffee cup sat half full on the kitchen counter. Her car keys rested in the ceramic bowl by the front door. The television murmured quietly in the living room, tuned to a morning talk show. But Rebecca Marshall was gone. No struggle, no note, no explanation. For nearly 3 decades, her disappearance would haunt this community, fracturing families and sowing seeds of suspicion that would take root in the most unlikely places. The question that hung over Greencastle for 28 years was simple, yet impossible to answer. Where was Rebecca Marshall? The town of Greencastle sits in Putnam County, roughly 40 miles west of Indianapolis, nestled among rolling farmland and patches of dense woodland that seemed to swallow the horizon. In 1995, the population hovered around 9,000 residents, most of whom could trace their families back 3 or 4 generations. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, where children rode bicycles until the streetlights came on, where the Friday night football game drew half the town to the bleachers. Main Street featured a single stoplight, a hardware store that had been in the same family since 1947, a diner called Rosie's that served coffee in thick white mugs, and a courthouse with limestone columns that had witnessed a century of small-town justice. The economic heartbeat of Greencastle pulsed from DePaul University on the north side of town, and the farms that stretched out in every direction, fields of corn and soybeans that turned the landscape green in summer and gold in autumn. For those who lived there, Greencastle represented safety, predictability, and the comforting rhythm of Midwestern life. Nothing truly terrible was supposed to happen in a place like this. Rebecca Marshall had been born Rebecca Lynn Carter in Terre Haute, 45 minutes to the west. She met David Marshall when she was 19, working the counter at a Dairy Queen during the summer between high school graduation and what she had hoped would be college. David was 23, tall and lean, with dark hair and an easy smile. He worked construction, mostly residential framing, and he drove a faded blue Ford pickup that backfired when he accelerated too quickly. They dated for 8 months before she discovered she was pregnant. They married in October of 1987 at the Putnam County Courthouse, just the two of them and 2 witnesses pulled from the hallway. Rebecca wore a cream-colored dress she had bought at a department store in Indianapolis. David wore jeans and a button-down shirt. The photograph from that day, which would later be examined by investigators and broadcast on local news, showed a young woman with long brown hair and hopeful eyes, standing beside a young man whose expression was harder to read. Their first child, a daughter named Emma, arrived in March of 1988. Their second, a son named Tyler, followed in June of 1991. They rented a small 2-bedroom house on Elm Street, a narrow residential road lined with modest homes built in the 1950s and 60s. The house had white aluminum siding, a front porch barely wide enough for 2 chairs, and a small backyard bordered by a chain-link fence. Rebecca stayed home with the children. David continued working construction, though the work was irregular and the pay modest. Those who knew the family described them as quiet, unremarkable, the kind of people you would pass at the grocery store and forget 5 minutes later. Rebecca was seen at the public library every Tuesday morning during story time, her children clinging to her legs while a librarian read picture books aloud. She shopped at the Kroger on the edge of town, always with a list written on the back of an envelope, always counting the total in her head before reaching the register. She attended the Methodist Church on Washington Street sporadically, sitting in the back pew with Emma and Tyler squirming beside her. David was rarely seen with her. He worked long hours, neighbors said. He kept to himself. He was polite enough when you waved to him, but he never stopped to talk. The morning of August 17, 1995, began like any other. The sun rose at 6:15, casting long shadows across Elm Street. The temperature climbed quickly, promising another day where the humidity would press down like a wet blanket. Rebecca woke before the children, as she always did. She made coffee in the small percolator on the counter, poured it into a white mug with a faded floral pattern, added 2 spoonfuls of sugar and a splash of milk. She turned on the television in the living room, volume low, and settled onto the couch with her coffee. This was her routine, these 15 or 20 minutes of quiet before Emma and Tyler woke and the day truly began. David had already left for work. He had a job framing a house on the south side of town, and he left each morning at 5:30, his truck rumbling down Elm Street while most of the neighborhood still slept. At 7:30, Emma emerged from the bedroom she shared with her brother, rubbing her eyes. Rebecca poured cereal into 2 plastic bowls, added milk, set them on the kitchen table. Tyler appeared moments later, dragging a stuffed bear that had lost one eye. They ate breakfast. Rebecca washed the dishes. She told the children to brush their teeth and get dressed. She planned to take them to the park later that morning, after the worst of the heat had passed. She had promised Emma they could feed the ducks at the pond. She had packed bread crusts in a paper bag the night before. The bag still sat on the kitchen counter when investigators arrived 3 days later. At approximately 9:40 in the morning, according to a neighbor named Dorothy Simmons who lived 2 houses down, Rebecca Marshall walked out her front door with Emma and Tyler. Dorothy was watering petunias in clay pots on her front porch and she waved. Rebecca waved back. She wore denim shorts and a white tank top. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail. The children ran ahead toward the small park at the end of Elm Street, a grassy square with 2 swing sets and a slide. Dorothy watched them disappear around the corner. She went back to watering her flowers. At 10:15, David Marshall's mother, Patricia, called the house on Elm Street. The phone rang 8 times before the answering machine picked up. Patricia left a message asking Rebecca to call her back. She wanted to discuss plans for Emma's upcoming birthday. Patricia tried again at 11:30. Again, the answering machine. At 12:40, Patricia drove to the house. She knocked on the front door, no answer. She peered through the living room window. The television was still on. She tried the doorknob, locked. She walked around to the back door, also locked. She called David at the construction site where he was working. He told her Rebecca had probably taken the kids somewhere. Maybe the library, maybe the store. Patricia drove to both. She did not find them. At 2:30, she called David again. This time he left work early and drove home. David Marshall arrived at the house on Elm Street at 3:10. He unlocked the front door with his key and stepped inside. The television murmured. The coffee mug sat on the counter, still half full, a thin film on the surface. The paper bag with bread crusts for the ducks sat beside it. Emma's favorite stuffed rabbit lay on the couch. Tyler's shoes, small blue sneakers with cartoon characters on the sides, sat neatly by the front door. David called out. No response. He walked through the small house, checking each room. The bedroom he shared with Rebecca was tidy, the bed made. The children's bedroom showed signs of their morning routine, clothes on the floor, toys scattered. The bathroom was empty. He returned to the living room and stood there, hands at his sides, staring at the coffee mug. At 3:45, he called the Greencastle Police Department. He reported that his wife and children were missing. Officer Frank Delgado arrived at the house at 4:10. He was 42 years old, a veteran of the department who had been born and raised in Greencastle. He asked David Marshall basic questions, taking notes in a small spiral notebook. When had he last seen his wife and children? That morning before he left for work around 5:20, had they argued? No. Did Rebecca have plans to go anywhere? Not that he knew of. Did she have friends she might visit? A few, but no one close. Did she have access to money? A small amount, maybe $40 or $50 in her purse. Was her purse missing? David checked. Yes. In her car, They only had one vehicle, his truck. She did not drive. Officer Delgado asked to see a recent photograph. David retrieved one from a drawer in the kitchen, a snapshot taken the previous summer showing Rebecca with both children at a 4th of July picnic. Officer Delgado radioed for additional units. By 5:30, 3 additional officers had arrived. They began a systematic search of the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen Rebecca Marshall or her children. Dorothy Simmons told them she had seen Rebecca leave with the kids around 9:40, heading toward the park. Officers walked to the park. It was empty. They searched the immediate area, calling out names, checking behind trees and playground equipment. They expanded the search to include surrounding streets, alleys, vacant lots. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across Greencastle, volunteers from the community joined the search. Members of the Methodist Church, parents from Emma's preschool, co-workers of David's from the construction site. By nightfall, more than 60 people were combing through the town, flashlights cutting through the darkness, voices echoing down empty streets. The search continued through the night and into the following day. The Putnam County Sheriff's Department joined the effort, bringing tracking dogs and additional personnel. The dogs were given items of clothing from the house on Elm Street, things that carried Rebecca's scent. They tracked to the park at the end of the street, circled the playground equipment, then lost the trail near the sidewalk. The dogs tracked to the edge of a wooded area on the north side of town, then lost the scent again. Investigators theorized that Rebecca and the children might have gotten into a vehicle, possibly with someone they knew. But who? And why would she leave without telling anyone? Without taking extra clothes for the children? Without taking their favorite toys? These questions circled through the investigation like vultures over carrion. The local newspaper, the Putnam County Sentinel, ran a front-page story on August 19th. The headline read, "Local woman and 2 children missing." The article included the photograph David had provided, Rebecca's face smiling out from newsprint. The radio stations in Indianapolis picked up the story. By August 20th, volunteers from surrounding counties arrived to help search. Teams combed through the wooded areas surrounding Greencastle, walking in straight lines through underbrush and fallen leaves, eyes scanning the ground for any sign of disturbance. They dragged the small pond at the park, finding nothing but mud and debris. They searched abandoned buildings, barns, outbuildings on farms. Days passed. No trace of Rebecca Marshall or her children emerged. Investigators from the Indiana State Police arrived on August 21st to assist. Detective Sarah Brennan, a specialist in missing persons cases, interviewed David Marshall extensively. She sat across from him at the kitchen table in the house on Elm Street, the same table where Emma and Tyler had eaten breakfast 4 days earlier. Detective Brennan asked David to walk through the morning of August 17th minute by minute. He did so calmly, methodically. He had woken at 5 in the morning. He had showered, dressed, made himself a cup of coffee. Rebecca was still asleep. The children were still asleep. He left at 5:30. He arrived at the job site at 6. He worked until approximately 3 when his mother called. Detective Brennan asked if he could provide the names of coworkers who could verify his presence at the job site. He could. Detective Brennan asked if he and Rebecca had been having marital problems. He hesitated before answering. Things had been difficult financially, he said. They argued sometimes about money, but nothing serious, nothing that would cause her to leave. Those who knew David Marshall offered varying perspectives. His coworkers described him as reliable, quiet, someone who kept his head down and did his work. His mother, Patricia, insisted her son was a good man, a devoted husband, a caring father. But neighbors on Elm Street told investigators something different. They described tension in the Marshall household, raised voices late at night, the sound of doors slamming. One neighbor, a retired postal worker named Eugene Fletcher, recalled seeing David and Rebecca arguing in the driveway several weeks before the disappearance. He could not hear the words, but the body language was unmistakable. Rebecca's arms crossed, David pointing his finger. The argument ended with Rebecca storming back into the house and David driving away, his truck tires squealing on the pavement. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves about inconsistencies they noticed. David's demeanor, for one thing. Most family members of missing persons exhibited visible distress. Tears, sleepless nights, frantic phone calls. David Marshall seemed composed, almost detached. He answered questions without emotion. He did not break down during interviews. He did not plead for his wife and children's return during the televised press conference on August 23rd. He stood beside Detective Brennan, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed somewhere in the middle distance, and read a prepared statement asking for information. His voice never wavered, clear as throat. Then there was the matter of the timeline. David claimed he had left for work at 5:30 on the morning of August 17th and arrived at the job site at 6. The distance from Elm Street to the construction site on the south side of town was approximately 7 miles. Under normal driving conditions, the trip should have taken no more than 12 minutes. Investigators drove the route themselves multiple times, testing different speeds, different routes. The longest it took was 15 minutes. So where was David Marshall between 5:30 and 6? When confronted with this discrepancy, David explained that he had stopped for coffee at a gas station on the edge of town. Which gas station? He could not remember. Investigators checked every gas station and convenience store between Elm Street and the job site. None of the clerks remembered seeing David that morning. None of the security cameras captured his truck. The timeline remained unaccounted for. Physical evidence was sparse, almost non-existent. Rebecca's purse was missing, but so were her identification, her small amount of cash, and a photograph she kept in her wallet showing Emma and Tyler as newborns. The house showed no signs of struggle. Nothing appeared disturbed or out of place. The door locks showed no signs of forced entry. Rebecca's clothing was still in the bedroom closet. Her toothbrush was still in the bathroom. If she had planned to leave permanently, she had taken almost nothing with her. If she had been taken against her will, she had gone quietly, without resistance, without a trace. Investigators canvassed the town repeatedly, showing photographs of Rebecca, Emma, and Tyler to every business owner, every gas station attendant, every person who might have seen something. One witness, a cashier at the Kroger, thought she might have seen Rebecca on the morning of August 17th, but she could not be certain. The timestamp on the receipt she remembered was 9:10, which would have been before Dorothy Simmons saw Rebecca leaving her house with the children. The timeline did not align. Another witness, a trucker passing through Greencastle on Route 231, called the tip line to report seeing a woman matching Rebecca's description walking along the highway with 2 small children around midday on August 17th. But the location he described was 12 miles south of Greencastle, and investigators could find no evidence that Rebecca had traveled that far. The witness later admitted he might have been mistaken about the date. As August turned to September and September faded into October, the active search efforts diminished. Volunteers returned to their normal lives. The news cycle moved on to other stories. The tip line grew quiet. Rebecca Marshall and her 2 children became another cold case file in the Putnam County Sheriff's Department. A folder that grew thicker with false leads and dead ends, but never yielded answers. Detective Brennan continued working the case intermittently, reviewing evidence, re-interviewing witnesses, hoping for a break that never came. David Marshall returned to work. He continued living in the house on Elm Street, sleeping in the bed he had shared with Rebecca, walking past the children's room where Emma's stuffed rabbit still sat on the unmade bed. By the spring of 1996, 8 months after the disappearance, the Marshall case file contained hundreds of pages of reports, interviews, and forensic analyses that led nowhere. The Indiana State Police officially classified Rebecca, Emma, and Tyler Marshall as missing persons, presumed deceased, though no bodies had been found. The Putnam County Prosecutor's Office reviewed the evidence against David Marshall multiple times, searching for grounds to bring charges. Each time, they concluded the evidence was insufficient. Suspicion was not proof. Inconsistencies were not evidence. Without a body, without a witness, without a confession, there was no case to prosecute. David Marshall remained free, living his life under the shadow of suspicion but beyond the reach of the law. Time passed. The seasons changed. The house on Elm Street, once the center of intense scrutiny, faded back into the quiet anonymity of the neighborhood. Patricia Marshall died in 1999 from complications of diabetes. David sold the house in 2000 and moved to Terre Haute, taking a job with a roofing company. The new owners of the house on Elm Street repainted the exterior, replaced the chain-link fence, planted new shrubs in the front yard. They knew nothing of the family that had lived there before, the woman and 2 children who had vanished one August morning. The story became local legend, the kind of tale people told in hushed voices at coffee shops and church gatherings. Did you hear about that family back in the 90s? The mother and kids who disappeared. I heard the husband did it, but they could never prove it. Greencastle moved on, but the absence of Rebecca, Emma, and Tyler Marshall remained, a hollow space that could never be filled. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, you understand the psychological weight of living with suspicion you cannot voice. David Marshall's younger sister, Jennifer, experienced this burden for years. She had been 21 when Rebecca disappeared, a college student at Indiana State University. She loved her brother. She remembered him as protective during their childhood, someone who had defended her against bullies, who had taught her to ride a bicycle. But as the years passed after Rebecca's disappearance, Jennifer noticed things that disturbed her. The way David never spoke Rebecca's name. The way he became agitated if anyone mentioned the case. The way he had boxed up all photographs of Emma and Tyler and stored them in his garage, never to be looked at again. Jennifer wanted to believe in her brother's innocence, but doubt grew like a tumor in her mind, spreading until it colored every memory, every interaction. In 2003, David Marshall remarried. His new wife, Angela, was a waitress he had met at a restaurant in Terre Haute. She knew about his past, about the missing family, but David had assured her he had nothing to do with their disappearance. Angela wanted to believe him. They bought a small house on the east side of Terre Haute. They lived quietly, rarely socializing, keeping mostly to themselves. But Angela began noticing things too. David's nightmares. He would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, gasping for air. When she asked what he had dreamed, he refused to answer. His temper. Small things would set him off, insignificant frustrations that would send him into rages that lasted hours. The way he controlled her movements, questioned where she had been, who she had talked to. The way he became paranoid, convinced that people were watching him, talking about him. By 2007, Angela had had enough. She filed for separation, citing irreconcilable differences. During the separation proceedings, David's attorney requested custody arrangements for the couple's young son, born in 2004. Angela's attorney filed a motion objecting, citing concerns about David's mental state and his history. The court ordered a psychological evaluation. David refused to comply. The case became contentious. Angela's attorney subpoenaed records related to the 1995 disappearance of Rebecca Marshall and her children, arguing that the circumstances raised legitimate concerns about David's fitness as a parent. David's attorney fought the subpoena, claiming the old case had no bearing on the current proceedings. The judge disagreed. The records were entered into evidence. It was during the review of these records that a young attorney working for Angela's legal team noticed something that had been overlooked for 12 years. In the initial investigation, detectives had documented the odometer reading on David Marshall's truck on August 18, 1995. When they had examined the vehicle as part of the investigation, the odometer showed 87,342 miles. In David's own statement to police, given on August 20th. He had mentioned that he had driven his truck to Indianapolis on August 15th, 2 days before Rebecca's disappearance, to pick up building supplies for his construction job. He estimated the round trip at approximately 100 miles. Investigators in 1995 had noted this, but had not pursued it. The young attorney, however, requested maintenance records for David's truck from a mechanic shop in Greencastle, where David had regular oil changes. The records showed that on July 28, 1995, less than 3 weeks before Rebecca's disappearance, David's truck had an odometer reading of 86,890 miles. Between July 28th and August 18th, the truck had accumulated 452 miles. David's worksite was 7 miles from his home. Even accounting for the trip to Indianapolis, the daily commutes, errands, and normal driving, the mileage seemed excessive. Where had David driven, and when? Angela's attorney forwarded this information to the Indiana State Police Cold Case Unit, which had been established in 2006. Detective Mark Hutchinson, newly assigned to the unit, reviewed the Marshall file. He found the discrepancy troubling. He began reconstructing David Marshall's movements during the days surrounding Rebecca's disappearance. Using gas station receipts, work logs, and witness statements, Detective Hutchinson mapped out a timeline. He discovered something remarkable. On the evening of August 16th, the night before Rebecca disappeared, David had told his construction foreman he needed to leave work early because he was not feeling well. He left the job site at 2 in the afternoon. He did not return home until after 10 that night. Rebecca had mentioned to Dorothy Simmons, the neighbor, that David had been gone that evening. She did not know where he had been. Dorothy recalled Rebecca seemed upset about it. Detective Hutchinson began examining maps of the area surrounding Greencastle, focusing on remote locations within a radius that matched the unaccounted mileage on David's truck. He paid particular attention to areas with dense woodland, abandoned properties, quarries, and bodies of water. One location stood out: a parcel of state forest land approximately 40 miles southeast of Greencastle, accessible by a series of rural roads that would roughly match the mileage discrepancy. The area was known locally as Morgan's Hollow, a densely wooded ravine with a small creek running through it. It was remote, rarely visited, and during the summer months, the undergrowth made much of it nearly impenetrable. In September 2008, Detective Hutchinson organized a search of Morgan's Hollow. He brought cadaver dogs, forensic anthropologists from Indiana University, and a team of trained searchers. They spent 4 days combing through the ravine, working in a grid pattern, marking areas with surveying flags. On the 3rd day, near the bank of the creek, in a depression partially hidden by fallen logs and dense vegetation, one of the cadaver dogs alerted. The team carefully excavated the area. 6 feet down, they found skeletal remains, 3 sets, an adult female, 2 children, one approximately 7 years old, one approximately 4 years old. The remains were consistent with Rebecca, Emma, and Tyler Marshall. Forensic analysis confirmed the identities through dental records. Rebecca's skull showed evidence of blunt force trauma, a fracture consistent with being struck by a heavy object. The children's remains showed no obvious signs of trauma, leading investigators to theorize they might have been smothered or otherwise killed in a way that left no skeletal evidence. Fabric remnants found with the remains matched the description of clothing Rebecca had been wearing the morning she disappeared. A forensic entomologist examined insect evidence and determined the remains had been in the ground since approximately August of 1995, consistent with the timeline of the disappearance. On October 14, 2008, 13 years and nearly 2 months after Rebecca Marshall and her children vanished, Detective Hutchinson and 2 other investigators drove to Terre Haute. They arrived at David Marshall's house at 7 in the morning. David answered the door in pajama bottoms and a t-shirt, his hair disheveled, eyes still heavy with sleep. Detective Hutchinson identified himself and informed David Marshall that he was under arrest for the homicides of Rebecca Marshall, Emma Marshall, and Tyler Marshall. David said nothing. His face remained expressionless. He did not resist. He did not ask questions. He allowed himself to be handcuffed and led to the patrol car while neighbors emerged from their homes to watch. The scene was captured by a local news crew that had been tipped off about the arrest. The footage would be broadcast repeatedly over the coming days, showing David Marshall, now 44 years old, gray appearing in his dark hair, being placed into the back of a police vehicle. The arrest made headlines across Indiana. The Putnam County Sentinel ran a banner headline, "Greencastle man arrested in 1995 disappearance." The Indianapolis Star covered the story extensively, interviewing former investigators, neighbors, and family members. Public reaction was divided. Those who had suspected David all along felt vindicated. They pointed to his suspicious behavior, the timeline inconsistencies, the way he had never seemed to grieve properly. Others expressed shock. They remembered David as quiet, reserved, but not violent. They could not reconcile the man they knew with the accusations now leveled against him. Jennifer Marshall, David's sister, provided a statement to the press through her attorney. "I have struggled for 13 years with doubt and guilt," the statement read. "I wanted to believe in my brother's innocence, but I could never silence the voice inside me that said something was wrong. Now that Rebecca, Emma, and Tyler have been found, I hope they can finally rest in peace. My heart breaks for what they endured." The trial began in March of 2009 in the Putnam County Courthouse, the same building where David and Rebecca had been married 22 years earlier. The prosecution, led by Putnam County Prosecutor Catherine Wills, presented a methodical case built on circumstantial evidence, forensic analysis, and the timeline reconstruction developed by Detective Hutchinson. They argued that on the evening of August 16th, David Marshall had driven to Morgan's Hollow to dig a grave, knowing what he planned to do the following morning. They argued that on August 17th, after his mother and others began searching for Rebecca and the children, David had taken the bodies to the pre-dug grave under cover of darkness, likely during the overnight hours of August 17th into August 18th. They presented the mileage discrepancy. They presented witnesses who testified to tension in the Marshall marriage. They presented forensic evidence linking the remains to the family. The defense, led by attorney Michael Brennan, argued the evidence was insufficient to prove David Marshall's guilt beyond reasonable doubt. They pointed out that the prosecution had no witnesses who could place David at Morgan's Hollow. They argued the mileage discrepancy could be explained by trips David did not remember or document. They suggested that someone else could have taken Rebecca and the children, though they offered no alternative suspect. They argued that the blunt force trauma to Rebecca's skull could have occurred after burial through natural processes or animal activity, though forensic experts disputed this. They painted David as a grieving husband and father who had been unfairly targeted by investigators fixated on the spouse as the perpetrator. Clear's throat, the most damning testimony came from Angela Marshall, David's second wife. She took the stand on the 8th day of the trial. Prosecutor Wills asked her to describe David's behavior during their marriage. Angela spoke quietly, her hands gripping the edges of the witness box. She described the nightmares. She described an incident in 2006 when David had been drinking and had said something that had chilled her to her core. They had been arguing about his refusal to attend counseling. Angela had shouted something about him needing to confront his past. David had turned to her, his face contorted with rage, and said, "You don't know what I've had to live with. You don't know what I've done." When Angela pressed him to explain, he had shut down, refused to speak for 2 days. She had never forgotten those words. The defense objected strenuously, arguing the statement was hearsay and inadmissible. The judge overruled the objection, noting that David's words were not being offered to prove the truth of what he said, but rather to show his state of mind. The jury leaned forward, absorbing every word. On April 3, 2009, after 11 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict: guilty on 3 counts of homicide. David Marshall showed no reaction as the verdict was read. He stared straight ahead, his face a mask. Sentencing was scheduled for May 15th. At the sentencing hearing, Prosecutor Wills argued for the maximum penalty. She read statements from Rebecca's family, from her parents who had lived with 13 years of not knowing what had happened to their daughter and grandchildren. She described the cruelty of what David had done, not only the killings themselves but the years of silence, allowing the community and investigators to search fruitlessly, while he knew exactly where the bodies lay. The judge sentenced David Marshall to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. As he was led from the courtroom, David turned briefly and looked at the gallery where Jennifer sat with tears streaming down her face. Their eyes met for just a moment. Then he was gone, escorted through a side door to begin a sentence that would end only with his passing. Rebecca Marshall and her children were buried together in a small cemetery on the outskirts of Greencastle in November of 2008, shortly after their remains were released by the coroner. The funeral service drew hundreds of people, many of whom had participated in the search 13 years earlier. Dorothy Simmons attended, as did Eugene Fletcher and many other neighbors from Elm Street. They stood in the cold November wind and listened to a minister speak about loss and memory and the enduring hope for justice. 3 white caskets, 1 large and 2 small, were lowered into the ground as mourners wept. A simple headstone marked the grave, listing 3 names and the words, "Together always." The case of Rebecca, Emma, and Tyler Marshall stands as a testament to the persistence of investigators who refused to abandon a cold case, who continued searching for answers long after most people had moved on. Detective Hutchinson would later say in interviews that he never forgot the photograph of Rebecca and her children, the image that had haunted him since he first opened the case file. He had promised himself he would find them, and he had kept that promise. For the community of Greencastle, the resolution brought both relief and renewed grief. The mystery was solved, but the solution offered no comfort. A mother and her 2 children had been taken from them by someone they had trusted, someone who had shared their lives and then erased them. Clear's Throat, the house on Elm Street, still stands, its white siding now painted gray, its small front porch still barely wide enough for 2 chairs. Different families have lived there over the years, none of them aware of the full history of the place, though some have heard stories. The park at the end of the street still has 2 swing sets and a slide. Children still play there on summer afternoons, their laughter echoing down the quiet street. The town of Greencastle has grown slightly, the population now exceeding 10,000, but it remains the kind of place where people know their neighbors, where the Friday night football game still draws crowds. The memory of what happened in August of 1995 has faded somewhat, remembered now by the older residents, but largely unknown to those who have moved to town in recent years. David Marshall remains incarcerated at the Indiana State Prison in Michigan City. He has never provided a full confession. He has never explained why he did what he did, what drove him to take the lives of his wife and children, and then bury them in a remote ravine 40 miles from home. He has never shown remorse, at least not publicly. His sister Jennifer has not visited him. She lives in Kentucky now, married with children of her own. She has changed her last name. She does not speak of her brother. For those who have ever loved someone who was lost, for those who have waited years for answers that might never come, the Marshall case serves as a reminder that truth, however painful, is always preferable to the agony of not knowing. Rebecca Marshall and her children spent 13 years in the ground, hidden from the world, while the person responsible walked free. But in the end, justice found its way through the darkness. Their voices, silent for so long, were finally heard. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.